I woke up drenched in sweat, my body aching, my mind foggy from exhaustion. The baby stirred beside me, his tiny mouth searching for food, his soft whimpers slicing through the silence of the dimly lit room. I reached for him, but my arms felt like lead. 4 days. It had only been 4 days since I gave birth, and I was already drowning. Sleep deprivation, the pain from delivery, the overwhelming wave of emotions. Everything crashed over me like a relentless tide, but none of it compared to the violation I felt when I heard the knock on the door. A sharp, insistent rap, not the hesitant knock of someone who respects your space, but the kind that announces control, the kind that says, "I'm here, and you can't stop me." Dan groggily sat up beside me, rubbing his eyes. "Who is that?" I already knew. I struggled to sit up, my body protesting every movement. "She came." Dan looked confused for a moment, still caught between sleep and wakefulness. Then it clicked. "Oh, right. My mom." Right. His mom. The woman I had explicitly told not to come. The woman who had booked an Airbnb without my consent. The woman who thought that her presence in my home, 4 days postpartum, was not just acceptable but necessary. I closed my eyes and inhaled slowly, willing myself to stay calm. "I told you I wasn't ready for visitors." Dan sighed, already getting out of bed. "She just wants to see the baby. It's not a big deal." Not a big deal, the words felt like a slap. I forced myself out of bed, ignoring the pain, the stitches, the way my body felt like it was falling apart. I made it to the living room just in time to see the door swing open. And there she was. Margaret Thompson, standing in my home like she owned the place. "Lauren," she exclaimed, arms outstretched as if expecting me to run into them. She didn't wait for an invitation before stepping inside. Behind her was her husband, carrying their suitcases, and her daughter, Olivia, clinging to her own husband's arm. I felt like I was suffocating. Margaret brushed past me, her eyes immediately landing on the bassinet. "Where's my grandson?" Dan let out a tired chuckle. "Mom, maybe let Lauren wake up a bit before." "Oh, nonsense! I've waited long enough." She turned back to me, her eyes glinting. 4 whole days, Lauren. That's practically an eternity." I wanted to scream. Instead, I clenched my fists. "I didn't say you could come." Margaret gasped theatrically, clutching her chest like I had just stabbed her. "Lauren, don't be ridiculous. We're family. Of course we came. We wanted to support you." Support, right? Because nothing screams support like invading my home when I explicitly said no. Nothing screams support like taking away the one thing I desperately needed. Control. Dan, still half asleep, scratched the back of his head. "Let's all just calm down. It's fine, right? They're here now." No, it wasn't fine, but what could I say? What could I do? I was outnumbered, exhausted, and I knew exactly how this would go. If I pushed back, I'd be the villain, the ungrateful daughter-in-law, the hormonal, irrational new mom. Margaret walked right past me like I was a piece of furniture, heading straight for the bassinet. She bent down, cooing softly. "Oh, look at him, he's perfect." I barely had time to react before she scooped him up, my stomach twisted. "Give him back." Margaret turned to me with a patronizing smile. "Oh, Lauren, don't be silly. I raised 2 kids. I think I know how to hold a baby." I felt the heat rising in my chest, my heart pounding in my ears. My baby, my son. And she was holding him like she had every right to, like my wishes didn't matter. Dan stepped beside me and placed a hand on my shoulder. "Babe, she just wants to hold him. It's fine." No, it wasn't. It was the opposite of fine. It was the beginning of something I had feared for months. If I didn't stop this now, I would never get my power back. But I was too weak, too drained, too overwhelmed. So I did nothing. I stood there and watched as Margaret rocked my son in my living room, pretending she had won. And deep down, I knew this was only the beginning. Margaret settled into my home like she had always belonged there. She didn't ask where things were, she just took. The guest room wasn't suitable, so she moved into the nursery, setting her suitcase in the corner like a permanent fixture. The kitchen wasn't organized to her liking, so she rearranged the cabinets while I sat on the couch, too exhausted to fight her. Every time I tried to protest, she dismissed me with a patronizing laugh. "Oh, Lauren, you have enough on your plate. Let me take care of things." That first night, I barely slept. The baby woke up every hour, his tiny cries cutting through the suffocating tension that filled the house. Every time I stirred, I could hear Margaret moving around, whispering to Olivia, opening and closing cabinets like she was setting up camp for the long haul. Dan was out cold beside me, oblivious to everything. The next morning, I walked into my own kitchen to find Margaret cooking breakfast. Bacon sizzled on the stove, the smell of coffee filled the air, and Olivia was sitting at the table, scrolling through her phone like she was in a cafe. It was like stepping into someone else's house. "Oh, look who's awake," Margaret chirped, flipping a pancake. "We let you sleep in a little." I glanced at the clock. It was barely past 6. "Where's the baby?" I asked, my stomach twisting. Margaret waved a dismissive hand. "Sleeping." I checked on him already. Something inside me snapped. "You went into my room?" She turned to look at me, spatula still in her hand, her expression completely unbothered. "Well, of course, I heard him stirring and I wanted to make sure he was okay. You were fast asleep." I gripped the edge of the counter. "You don't go into my room, Margaret." She laughed, shaking her head. "Lauren, I understand you're overwhelmed, but I'm just trying to help. You'll appreciate it once you get some rest." I wasn't overwhelmed. I was furious. But what was I supposed to do? Rip the spatula out of her hand? Scream at her until she left? She had barely been here for 24 hours and I already felt like I was disappearing. Dan walked in, yawning, rubbing his eyes. He smiled when he saw the table. "Wow, Mom, you didn't have to do all this." Margaret beamed. "Of course I did. You two need a break." I felt my jaw clench as Dan kissed my temple and sat down. He didn't see the problem. He never saw the problem. Margaret placed a plate in front of me, then sat across from me, sipping her coffee. "So, I was thinking, since I'm already here, why don't I stay an extra week, just until you're really back on your feet?" My stomach turned to ice. "No." She blinked at me, feigning innocence. "No? You're not staying another week," I said, my voice sharper than I intended. "You weren't even supposed to be here now." Dan let out a nervous chuckle. "Lauren, come on, she's just offering to help." I turned to him, trying to keep my voice steady. "I don't need help, I need space." Margaret sighed dramatically, shaking her head. "Lauren, I don't know why you're being so difficult about this. Every new mother needs support. When I had Dan, my mother practically moved in with me. And I'm sure she asked first." The tension in the room thickened. Olivia finally looked up from her phone, her eyebrows raised like she was watching a reality show unfold in front of her. Margaret exhaled slowly, placing her mug down. "I know you're tired. I know you're emotional. But this hostility isn't healthy, Lauren." I could feel the rage bubbling under my skin. She was making me sound insane, like I was some irrational hormonal mess for simply wanting my boundaries respected. Dan reached for my hand, squeezing it gently. "Babe, let's just talk about this later, okay?" I yanked my hand away. "There's nothing to talk about. I said no." Margaret pursed her lips, then turned to Dan. "Well, if she doesn't want me here, I suppose I'll go." She pushed back from the table, sighing. "I just thought my grandson deserved a grandmother who actually cared." Dan flinched. I closed my eyes, exhaling through my nose. There it was, the guilt trip. The perfectly calculated, manipulative little dagger aimed directly at my husband's heart. And just like that, I knew I had lost. Dan sighed, rubbing his temples. "Mom, don't be like that." Margaret crossed her arms. "I just don't understand why she's acting like this. I come all this way to help and I get treated like an intruder." I wasn't acting like anything. I just wanted my home back, my baby back, my life back. Dan turned to me, his expression pleading. "Lauren, can we just—" "No," I cut him off. "I'm done talking about this." Margaret pressed her lips together, then smiled sweetly at me. "All right, sweetheart, if that's what you want." It was a lie. I could see it in her eyes. This wasn't over. I stood up, my appetite completely gone, and walked back to the bedroom, my legs shaking with frustration. I sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the bassinet. My son was still asleep, his tiny chest rising and falling peacefully. He had no idea that the world outside was spinning out of control. A few minutes later, I heard the sound of voices outside my door. Quiet, but urgent. "Dan and Margaret." "She's just stressed, Mom," Dan was saying. "You know how it is." "She's shutting me out, Daniel," Margaret whispered, her voice thick with fake hurt. "I don't understand why she doesn't trust me." I know. She's just..." Dan hesitated. "She'll come around. Just give her time." Give me time, as if this was my fault, as if I needed to adjust to the fact that my boundaries meant nothing. I clenched my fists, staring at my son's sleeping face. If I didn't put a stop to this now, I would never get my control back. I woke up to silence. That was the first sign that something was wrong. The baby never slept for long, and by now I was used to the sound of his tiny cries pulling me from sleep every few hours, but now, as I lay in the dark, something felt off. My heart pounded as I reached out instinctively toward the bassinet, my fingers brushing against the empty sheets. And panic surged through my chest like ice water. I sat up so fast that pain shot through my abdomen, but I ignored it. My hands fumbled over the bassinet again, as if I had somehow missed him in the darkness. But no, he wasn't there. I shoved the blankets off and stumbled to my feet, my breathing shallow. The bedroom door was open, just a crack. I knew I had closed. I felt like I was underwater, moving through thick, suffocating pressure as I pushed the door open and stepped into the hallway. The house was quiet, but there was a faint glow coming from the living room. The moment I turned the corner, I saw her. Margaret, sitting on the couch, cradling my baby in her arms. My body went cold with rage. She was rocking him gently, humming some old lullaby under her breath, completely unaware of, or worse, indifferent to, the fact that she had just stolen my child from his bed in the middle of the night. I forced my voice to stay steady, but it came out sharp, a blade in the dark. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" Margaret didn't even flinch. She just smiled down at the baby like I wasn't even there. "He was fussing. I heard him from my room." My hands clenched into fists. "You had no right to take him." Margaret let out a soft laugh, as if I had just said something amusing. "Oh, Lauren, don't be dramatic. I used to do this with Dan all the time. Babies need comfort, a mother's touch." I stepped forward, my whole body trembling. "I am his mother." She looked up at me then, her smile tightening. "And I'm his grandmother. I think that counts for something." I reached out. "Give him to me." Margaret held him a little closer. "Lauren, you're exhausted. You should be resting. I don't mind taking care of him for a little while." She wasn't handing him over, she was refusing. Something inside me snapped. I said, "Give him to me." The edge in my voice must have finally registered, because Margaret sighed and shifted the baby toward me. "Fine, if you're going to make such a fuss." I grabbed my son and held him tightly against my chest, my entire body tense with the primal need to protect. He stirred slightly, but he was still asleep, peaceful, completely unaware of the battle being waged over him. I turned away without another word, walking straight back to my bedroom. I didn't even look at Dan, who was still snoring softly under the covers. Once inside, I locked the door. I sat down on the bed, cradling my baby, my heart still pounding. The reality of what had just happened hit me like a freight train. She had taken him. She had walked into my room, into my space, and decided that her wants were more important than my rights as his mother. I pressed my lips against my baby's soft head, inhaling his warmth. This wasn't just some overstepping grandmother. This was control. This was possession. And I was done. The next morning, Margaret acted like nothing had happened. She was in the kitchen when I came out, pouring coffee and chatting with Olivia about some new yoga studio back home. She smiled at me. "Good morning, sweetheart. Did you sleep well?" I stared at her, my hands tightening around the baby's blanket. Dan walked in behind me, stretching. "Morning, everyone." He walked straight to the coffee pot, oblivious to the fire burning beneath my skin. I turned to him. "We need to talk." Dan blinked at me, mid-sip. Okay?" "In private." Margaret let out a soft chuckle. "Lauren, don't be silly. We're all family here." I ignored her, already walking toward the bedroom. Dan followed, looking confused. The moment the door shut, I turned to him, my voice low and furious. "She took the baby last night." Dan frowned. "What?" "She took him, Dan, out of his bassinet, while we were asleep." Dan rubbed his face. "I'm sure she was just trying to help." I felt my stomach drop. "Help?" He sighed. "Babe, she's not trying to hurt anyone. She loves the baby." I stared at him, my nails digging into my palms. That's not the point. She doesn't get to take him. She doesn't get to decide when she's in charge. She doesn't get to walk into our room in the middle of the night and act like she has more of a right to him than I do. Dan exhaled slowly. Okay, I get it. You're upset. Upset, like I was throwing a tantrum over something trivial. I took a step closer, lowering my voice. She is treating him like her baby, Dan, not like a grandchild, like he belongs to her. And you're letting it happen. Dan's jaw tightened. That's not fair. Isn't it? I shot back. You let her come here without asking me. You let her take over our house, and now she's taking our son out of his bed in the middle of the night, and you still don't see the problem? Dan ran a hand through his hair. Look, I get that she can be a little much sometimes, but... No more buts. My voice was shaking now, but not from fear, from rage. Either you back me up on this, or I will handle it myself. Dan stared at me for a long moment, something shifting in his expression. Maybe he finally saw how serious I was. Maybe he realized that this wasn't something I was going to just let go. Finally, he nodded. Okay, I'll talk to her. I exhaled, some of the tension easing from my shoulders. Today, Dan. Not later. Today. He hesitated, then nodded again. Today. I turned toward the door, but before I could open it, he spoke again. Lauren, I know she drives you crazy, but she's still my mom. I looked at him over my shoulder. And I'm your wife. And that's your son. Don't forget that. When we walked back into the kitchen, Margaret was still chatting with Olivia, sipping her coffee like she hadn't done something unforgivable just hours before. Dan cleared his throat. Mom, we need to talk. Margaret looked up, eyebrows raised. Oh? Dan glanced at me, then back at her. You can't take the baby in the middle of the night. That's not okay. Margaret's expression flickered just for a second, just long enough for me to see it. The irritation. The disbelief that she was being challenged. Then she smiled. Oh, Daniel, don't be ridiculous. I was just trying to help. Dan stood his ground. It doesn't matter. You don't do that. Period. Margaret sighed, setting down her coffee. I think Lauren is being a little sensitive about this. I opened my mouth, but Dan cut me off. It's not up for debate. Margaret's lips pressed together. Well, I see how it is. She picked up her coffee again, but I saw it in her eyes. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. Dan thought the conversation was over. He thought that because he had finally told his mother no, she would respect that boundary, that she would learn her place, that we could all move forward like rational adults. He was wrong. Margaret didn't argue that day. She didn't fight back or stomp her feet. She just smiled, nodded, and said, Of course, Daniel, I only want what's best for the baby. Then she went about her day as if nothing had happened. She acted perfectly normal, perfectly pleasant, as if she hadn't just been caught sneaking into my bedroom and taking my child without permission. But I wasn't fooled. I watched her closely. I noticed the way her smile never quite reached her eyes, the way she held the baby just a little too long before handing him back, the way she would give me that saccharine look, like she was waiting for me to slip up, waiting for an opportunity to strike again. That night, I locked the bedroom door. 2 days passed. Dan was relieved, thinking we had reached some kind of truce. He started to relax, talking about how nice it was to have extra hands around the house, how his mom was really trying, and how I should give her a chance. I said nothing. Then, on the third night, I woke up to the sound of my phone vibrating on the nightstand. I groggily reached for it, squinting at the screen. It was a text from my friend Claire. Hey, just saw a Facebook post from your MIL, thought you should know. My stomach dropped. I immediately clicked the link she sent. And there it was. A picture of Margaret holding my son, the caption read. Late night snuggles with my little angel. Some babies just need their grandma more than anyone else. My vision went red. I shook Dan awake. Look at this. He groaned, rubbing his eyes. What? I shoved the phone in his face. She's posting pictures of our baby in the middle of the night when she's not even supposed to be near him. Dan blinked at the screen, then sighed. Lauren, it's just a picture. I nearly threw the phone across the room. It's not just a picture, Dan. She's doing it again. She went into the nursery while we were sleeping and took him after we explicitly told her not to. Dan sat up, frowning. You don't know she took him out of his crib. Maybe she... I cut him off. Dan, look at the timestamp, 2:37 a.m. If she wasn't taking him out of his crib, then how the hell did she get this picture? Dan's mouth opened, then closed. She is testing us, I said, my voice shaking with rage. She's seeing how far she can push before we do something, and you're letting her. Dan ran a hand through his hair. I'll talk to her. I laughed coldly. Oh yeah? Like last time? What are you gonna do? Ask her to please not kidnap our son again? Dan groaned. Lauren, come on, you're making this sound worse than it is. I stared at him, barely able to contain my fury. How much worse does it need to get before you take it seriously? But he didn't answer. I took a slow, deep breath, trying to keep my voice steady. This isn't just about the baby, Dan. This is about us. If you can't stand up for me, for us, then what the hell are we even doing? Dan looked at me, something shifting in his expression. For the first time, I saw real doubt in his eyes, real fear. Maybe he finally understood that I wasn't just being dramatic. Maybe he realized that if he didn't fix this, I would. I grabbed my phone and walked out of the room. Margaret was in the kitchen the next morning, pouring herself coffee like nothing had happened. Morning, sweetheart, she chirped. I didn't respond. I walked straight past her, grabbed a mug from the cabinet and slammed it down onto the counter hard enough to make her flinch. Margaret glanced at me, then gave a soft laugh. Oh dear, someone's grumpy today. I turned to her, my hands trembling from how hard I was gripping the counter. You took my baby last night. She blinked, feigning confusion. Lauren, I don't know what you mean. I pulled out my phone and held up the post. This. You posted this at 2:37 a.m. You took him after we told you not to. Margaret's smile didn't waver. Oh, Lauren, you're being so dramatic. He was fussing, and I simply picked him up to soothe him. It's what grandmothers do.
I leaned in, lowering my voice. No, what grandmothers do is respect the mother of their grandchild.
Margaret's expression hardened just a fraction. I was only trying to help. You're not helping. You're overstepping. You don't get to play mommy just because you feel like it. Margaret sighed, setting her mug down. Lauren, I understand that you're overwhelmed. I let out a sharp laugh. Do not patronize me. Her eyes darkened. Dan walked in just then, rubbing his temples like he could already feel the headache forming. He glanced between us. What's going on? Margaret immediately softened, turning to him with a sad little sigh. Oh, Daniel, I think your wife is feeling a little stressed this morning. Dan frowned. Mom. Margaret put a hand on his arm. Honestly, I don't know why she's so upset. I was just comforting the baby. I think we can all agree that he needs love from everyone in his family, right? Dan hesitated, and I felt my stomach drop. But then, to my surprise, he gently pulled his arm away. Mom, Lauren's right. We set a boundary and you ignored it. Again. Margaret's face stiffened. Daniel, No, Dan said firmly. No more excuses. No more acting like she's overreacting. You can't take the baby in the middle of the night, and you sure as hell can't post about it like he's yours. Silence. Margaret stared at him, her mouth opening slightly in shock. Then she turned to me, and for the first time since she arrived, the mask slipped. The warmth, the sweetness, it all vanished. Her eyes were cold. This isn't over, she said softly. A chill ran down my spine. Dan straightened. Actually, it is. You need to leave. Margaret flinched like he had struck her. Daniel, you don't mean that.
I do, he said. You're leaving. Today.
Margaret let out a shaky laugh. You're choosing her over your own mother? Dan exhaled, looking tired but resolute. I'm choosing my wife. I should have done it sooner. Margaret looked at me again, and in that moment I knew she hated me. She despised me. But I didn't care. Because I had won. Margaret let out a sharp breath, her hands shaking as she picked up her coffee cup. Fine, she said stiffly. If that's what you want, Daniel. She turned on her heel and walked out of the kitchen. I let out a breath I didn't realize I had been holding. Dan turned to me. Are you okay? I looked at him, my heart still pounding, and nodded. For the first time since she arrived, I finally felt like I could breathe. Margaret didn't leave quietly. She spent the rest of the morning in the guest room, slamming drawers, making loud, pointed phone calls, and muttering under her breath every time she walked past me. Dan tried to stay out of it, retreating to the nursery to rock the baby, but I could see the guilt in his eyes. He still wasn't used to standing up to her. He probably never thought he'd have to. Olivia, of course, made a dramatic show of being caught in the middle. She hovered in the kitchen, sighing loudly and giving me looks like I had just burned the family home to the ground. At one point, she actually had the nerve to say, "You know, you could have handled this better," before walking away without waiting for a response. I ignored them both. I had won the battle, but I knew Margaret wasn't the type to surrender so easily. If she was leaving, she was going to make sure she left as the victim. And I was right. An hour before she was supposed to leave, Dan's phone rang. I knew it was her before he even picked up. He glanced at me warily before stepping outside to take the call. I sat in the living room, bouncing the baby in my arms, my heart pounding. I wasn't stupid. I knew exactly what she was doing. Dan was gone for almost 20 minutes. When he finally came back inside, his face was tense, his shoulders tight. I didn't wait for him to start. "What did she say?" Dan sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "She's upset." I let out a humorless laugh. "Of course she is. She says she feels unwelcome, like she's being cut out of our lives." "She is unwelcome, Dan. That's the whole point." He exhaled heavily, sitting down beside me. "Lauren, she's my mom. She's not just going to disappear." I shifted the baby to my other arm and looked at him carefully. "Did she ask you to pick a side?" Dan hesitated.
That was all the answer I needed.
"She wants you to feel guilty," I said, keeping my voice calm. "She wants you to think that if you set boundaries, she'll cut you off." Dan shook his head. "She wouldn't do that." "She would, and even if she doesn't, she wants you to believe she would." I looked at him, my grip on the baby tightening. "That's manipulation, Dan." Dan looked away. "She's hurt." "No," I corrected. "She's angry that she didn't get her way." Dan didn't respond right away. I could tell he was still trying to process everything, still fighting against a lifetime of conditioning. His whole life, his mother had been at the center of everything. He had never been forced to choose between her and someone else. Until now. I softened my voice. "You don't have to go no contact with her, but things have to change." Dan ran a hand through his hair. "Like what?" I took a slow breath, steadying myself. "She doesn't come over uninvited. She doesn't take the baby without asking. She doesn't get to act like she is the parent. And if she can't respect that, then she doesn't get to be around him at all." Dan looked down, his jaw tight. "She's not gonna take this well." "I don't get it." That got his attention. He looked up at me, surprised by the steel in my voice. I held his gaze. "I am not going to spend the next 18 years fighting for my own child. I am his mother, not her. And if you don't have my back on this, I will handle it myself." Dan stared at me for a long moment, then he sighed, leaning forward and resting his elbows on his knees. "Okay," he said quietly. "You're right." Relief flooded through me so quickly that I almost felt lightheaded. Dan exhaled, running a hand over his face. "I'll talk to her again before she leaves." "She's not going to listen." "Maybe not," he admitted, "but she needs to hear it anyway." And so, a half hour later, he did. Margaret was in the kitchen, her suitcase by the door, her expression carefully neutral. Olivia stood beside her, arms crossed, radiating silent judgment. Dan cleared his throat. "Mom, before you go, we need to talk." Margaret looked up, her lips pressing together. "Oh." Dan glanced at me, then back at her. "Things have to change. If you want to be involved in our lives, you need to respect our boundaries. That means listening when we tell you no. That means treating Lauren like she's the mother of our child, not you." Margaret's smile didn't falter, but I saw the flicker of irritation in her eyes. "Daniel, I never meant to overstep." Dan sighed. "You did overstep." Margaret tilted her head, her expression almost pitying. "Honey, you don't understand. I know what I'm doing. I've raised 2 children. I have experience that Lauren doesn't." I clenched my jaw, but Dan beat me to it. "That doesn't matter. He's our son, and we make the decisions, not you." Margaret's face went cold. "I see." Dan exhaled. Mom, we want you to be part of his life, but you have to respect us. There was a long silence, then Margaret let out a small laugh, shaking her head. Well, I suppose I've been put in my place. Dan's shoulders tensed. Mom.
No, no, she said lightly. I understand. You've made yourself very clear.
I didn't trust that tone for a second. Margaret picked up her suitcase, turning to Olivia. Shall we? Olivia gave me one last pointed look before grabbing her bag and heading for the door. Margaret paused, looking at Dan. I just hope you don't regret this. Dan stiffened. What does that mean? Margaret gave him a sad little smile. You'll see. And then she walked out the door. Dan let out a slow breath, running a hand through his hair. That could have gone worse. I watched through the window as Margaret got into the car, Olivia murmuring something to her. She didn't look back at the house once. I turned to Dan. She's gonna punish you for this. Dan sighed. I know. She's gonna play the victim. She's gonna call the rest of your family and tell them I'm keeping her grandchild from her. Dan rubbed his face. Probably. I exhaled slowly. Are you ready for that? Dan was quiet for a long moment. Then he nodded. Yeah, I think I am. I studied him, searching for hesitation, for doubt, but I didn't see any. For the first time, I believed him. I reached for his hand, he squeezed it, his grip steady. And for the first time since this nightmare began, I actually felt like we were on the same team. Margaret might have left, but she made sure her presence was still felt. The calls started almost immediately. At first, they were just to Dan, long, guilt-laced monologues about how much she missed him, how hard this was for her, how she didn't understand why she was suddenly being treated like an outsider. Then she started calling his relatives, making sure they heard her side of the story, before we had a chance to say anything. Dan's phone became a weapon, buzzing constantly with incoming messages from aunts, uncles, even his father, people who had barely been involved in our lives until now. Each message was a variation of the same theme. She's your mother. How could you do this to her? I ignored most of it, but Dan struggled. I saw the way it wore him down, how every message chipped away at him, making him question if we had overreacted. The final straw came 2 weeks later when he got a call from his father. I was in the nursery rocking the baby when I heard the front door slam. I flinched, then heard Dan's heavy footsteps pacing back and forth. I stood up, carefully placing the baby in his crib before stepping out into the hallway.
Dan was standing in the kitchen, gripping the edge of the counter, his face tense with anger.
I approached cautiously. What happened? He let out a harsh breath, shaking his head. My dad just called. I already knew it wasn't good. His father rarely called unless Margaret needed backup. Dan laughed bitterly. Guess what? According to him, we need to apologize to my mother for mistreating her. He turned to look at me, his jaw tight. And if we don't, she's threatening to take legal action. I froze. What? Dan nodded, still laughing humorlessly. Yeah, apparently she thinks she has grandparents' rights or some bullshit. She told my dad that if we keep keeping her grandson from her, she'll take us to court. Rage bubbled up inside me, sharp and acidic. She has no case. None. Dan ran a hand through his hair. I know, but that's not the point. She wants to scare us. She wants us to believe she'll do it. He exhaled. And honestly, I think she would. I gritted my teeth. Then let's take this seriously. Dan looked at me, something uncertain in his eyes. What do you mean? I straightened. I mean, let's stop playing defense. She wants to make threats? Fine. Let's make it clear that we're not afraid of her. Dan hesitated, but I could see something shifting in him. He was exhausted, tired of being manipulated. Finally, he nodded. What do you want to do? I pulled out my phone. First, we document everything. Every call, every text, every time she tries to push her way in. I met his eyes. And then we cut her off completely. Dan exhaled slowly. That's big. He gave us no choice. He didn't argue. We spent the next hour going through our messages, taking screenshots, saving voicemails. Dan sent a final text to Margaret. This stops now. We will not tolerate manipulation, threats, or boundary violations. If you continue to harass us, we will take legal action. Do not contact us again." Then he blocked her number. She didn't respond right away, but we both knew that silence wouldn't last. The real storm hit 3 days later. It started with Olivia. She showed up unannounced, knocking on the door like she was trying to break it down. I opened it just enough to see her, keeping the chain locked. "Let me in," she snapped. "I didn't move. No." Olivia let out an irritated laugh. "You're seriously doing this? Keeping family out? You know how much you're hurting my mom?" "She's the one who made this happen." Olivia's eyes narrowed. "She's considering taking you to court. You know that, right?" "She has no case." "She has money," Olivia countered. "Do you really want to risk this?" I clenched my jaw. She's not getting near my son again, and if she wants to waste her money dragging this into court, she can. It won't change anything. Olivia stared at me for a long moment, then scoffed. "You've turned my brother against his own mother. Do you know how disgusting that is?" I smiled coldly. "No, but I bet Margaret does." Olivia's expression twisted in anger. "You're going to regret this." I slammed the door in her face. That night, the texts from unknown numbers started. Some were fake apologies. "Can we just talk? I miss you, sweetheart." Others were pure guilt-tripping. "I can't believe you're doing this to me. I just want to see my grandson. Do you really want him to grow up without his grandmother?" I ignored them all. The next morning, I woke up to something worse. Dan was standing by the front door, holding a letter. His face was pale. I took it from his hands and read the first few lines. It was from a lawyer, a formal request for grandparents' visitation rights. I felt sick. She actually did it. Dan sat down heavily on the couch, rubbing his face. "I can't believe this." I took a slow breath, forcing myself to stay calm. She's bluffing. She has no legal grounds. We have proof that she ignored our boundaries, that she took the baby without permission. Dan nodded numbly. "Yeah, but now we have to deal with it." I straightened, already opening my phone. "Then we'll deal with it." The next few days were a blur of legal consultations and paperwork. We spoke to a lawyer who immediately reassured us that Margaret had no case. But that didn't mean she couldn't try to drag us through the process, force us to waste time and money fighting her off. "She's counting on you backing down," our lawyer said. "Don't." I had no intention of backing down. Dan, for all his hesitation in the past, finally seemed to be fully on my side. He spoke to his father, making it clear that Margaret was out of our lives permanently. It wasn't easy, but it was necessary. 3 weeks after filing her claim, Margaret withdrew it. The message was clear. She never actually expected to win. She just wanted to scare us. But we weren't scared anymore. The final text she sent before I blocked her number for good was short. "I hope you're happy you've destroyed this family." I read it once, then deleted it. Dan sat beside me, watching. "So, that's it?" I nodded. "That's it." He exhaled, leaning back against the couch. "I can't believe it came to this." I looked down at our son, peacefully asleep in my arms. It didn't have to. Dan reached over, gently placing his hand over mine. "I'm sorry it took me so long to see it." I met his eyes. "You see it now. That's what matters." Margaret was gone. For good. And for the first time since all of this started, I felt free. Months passed and Margaret became nothing more than a ghost. At first, it felt unnatural, waiting for the next phone call, the next manipulative message, the next inevitable attempt to force her way back in. But nothing came. No more fake apologies, no more threats, no more guilt-tripping. She had gone silent. Dan struggled with it more than I did. I would catch him staring at his phone sometimes, his thumb hovering over his blocked contacts list. He never said what he was thinking, but I knew. He had spent his whole life bending to his mother's will, being conditioned to believe that cutting her off was unthinkable. Now, for the first time, he was free, and I think that terrified him. One night, I found him sitting on the couch long after he was supposed to be in bed. The glow of the television cast shadows across his face, but he wasn't watching it. His gaze was distant, unfocused. I sat down beside him. "You okay?" He exhaled, rubbing his hands together. "Yeah, just thinking." I didn't press him. Instead, I waited. After a long silence, he finally said, I keep wondering if I should have handled it differently, if I should have done more to make her understand. I sighed, resting my head against the couch. She never wanted to understand, Dan. That was the problem. He nodded slowly, but I could tell he wasn't fully convinced. I reached for his hand, squeezing it gently. You did the right thing. For us. For our son. Dan turned to me, searching my face. Do you think she'll ever stop blaming me? I gave him a sad smile. It doesn't matter if she does. That was the part he was still coming to terms with, the idea that he didn't need her approval, that for the first time in his life, he had chosen his family over hers, and she had punished him for it. But as the months went on, I saw something shift in him. The guilt started to fade. He started to relax, to laugh more, to enjoy our son without the constant pressure of his mother's expectations looming over him. The peace was a new kind of freedom neither of us had ever known before. One afternoon, we took the baby to the park. It was one of those rare, crisp autumn days where the air was cool, but the sun was warm. Dan held our son in his arms, spinning him around gently while the baby giggled. I stood back watching them, feeling a deep, unshakable sense of relief. This was our life now. Ours. No more unwanted visitors, no more stolen moments, no more battles for control. Just us. Dan caught me watching and smiled. What? I shook my head. Nothing, just, I love you. His smile softened. I love you too. He turned back to our son, pressing a kiss to his tiny forehead. And for the first time in a long, long time, I felt safe.